Father and son vanish on mountain hike 10 years ago. After this year's mom gets mysterious letter. A sun-drenched day, a father and son heading off into the wild, their eyes full of adventure. Now, imagine that sunny day turning into an endless night, a silence so deep it just swallows every bit of hope. For 10 long years, that silence was all one mother knew. 10 years, until a single piece of paper shows up on her doorstep, carrying whispers from a past everyone thought was buried. What if the lost weren't really lost at all, but hidden by a truth even more painful than their absence? The story we're about to share, about Sarah, David, and their son Ethan Hayes, is a work of fiction. We've carefully crafted this account to explore the kind of deep emotions and awful uncertainties that families go through when someone they love vanishes without a trace. Now, the names, the specific places like the sprawling Blackwood Mountains, and exactly how things happened are all part of the story we've created. But the core themes? Ambiguous loss, the incredible efforts of search and rescue teams, and that stubborn hope that refuses to die against all odds. Those are tragically real for so many. Every year, countless people go missing in wilderness areas, leaving behind a tangled mess of unanswered questions and broken lives. This story taps into the real emotional toll of those experiences, the mental anguish of not knowing, and that desperate human need for closure. It's a journey into a mystery that kicks off on a perfect day, spirals into a decade of haunting silence, and is then shattered by one single, mysterious letter. David Hayes was a man who truly found peace in the rugged outdoors. He loved the untamed wilderness, and it was a passion he was excited to share with his 10-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan, a bright kid with endless curiosity, absolutely idolized his dad. Their hikes weren't just trips, they were like sacred rituals, moments where they bonded surrounded by towering peaks and whispering pines. The Blackwood Mountains, a huge area with tough trails and stunning views, was their special spot. They knew its paths, its moods, its secret corners. Or at least, they thought they did. Sarah Hayes watched them go that crisp autumn morning, a familiar warmth spreading through her. David, always the careful planner, had checked their gear twice: tough boots, extra clothes, a map, compass, a loaded first aid kit, and plenty of food and water for a day-long trip. Ethan, practically bouncing with excitement, chattered on about the eagles he hoped to see and the streams he wanted to check out. He'd hugged her tight, his small arms surprisingly strong. "We'll be back before dark, Mom. Promise." His voice, so clear and sure, would echo in her memory for years. The plan was straightforward, a challenging but familiar loop trail to Starlight Peak, which offered panoramic views David swore could cure any worry. They were experienced hikers. David was strong, knew his stuff, and was always cautious. Ethan, even though he was young, was surprisingly tough and good on the trail for his age. Sarah had no reason to feel anything but that usual little pang of knowing her boys were off on an adventure without her, a feeling that quickly turned into looking forward to their return, full of stories and flushed with the excitement of the wild. The hours of that day passed like any other. Sarah kept busy around their cozy home, nestled right at the edge of the wilderness, with the distant shapes of the Blackwood Mountains a constant, comforting sight. She'd glance at the clock now and then, a mental timer ticking down to when they should be back. As late afternoon started to fade into early evening, the first unsettling feelings began to creep into her heart. The sun, a fiery ball, started its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but there was still no sign of David and Ethan. The familiar rumble of their old Jeep wasn't in the gravel driveway. She told herself they were just running late, maybe caught up watching a sunset from the peak, or perhaps Ethan had gotten tired, and they were taking it slow on the way down. These were logical explanations, trying to hold back a rising wave of anxiety. But as twilight deepened, casting long, spooky shadows across the land, and the mountains began to meld into one huge, dark shape, logical thought started to unravel. Darkness fell completely, like a heavy blanket smothering the last bits of Sarah's composure. Their promise to be back before dark was now broken. Her calls to David's cell phone went straight to voicemail, and each unanswered ring just cranked up her terror. Ethan didn't have a phone. The house, usually filled with the comfortable sounds of family life, felt empty and cold, the silence broken only by the frantic thumping of her own heart. By 9 p.m., panic had well and truly taken over. Sarah called the local sheriff's department. At first, they were measured. Hikers often misjudge time or take unexpected turns. But as Sarah described David's experience and how punctual he usually was, and the fact that their son was so young, a sense of urgency began to grow. The first search and rescue teams were mobilized by dawn. The days that followed became a nightmarish blur of hope and despair. The search for David and Ethan Hayes turned into a massive operation. Professional rescue teams, volunteers from nearby towns, K-9 units, and helicopters with thermal imaging scoured the rugged terrain of the Blackwood Mountains. They combed every known trail, every ravine, every dense patch of trees. Sarah, a shadow of her former self, waited at the base camp, her eyes raw from crying and lack of sleep, clinging to every tiny piece of news, every crackle from the radio. But the mountains, their beloved sanctuary, gave up nothing. Not a footprint out of place. Not a discarded wrapper. Not even a broken branch to suggest a fall or a struggle. It was as if David and Ethan had just stepped off the path and vanished into the crisp autumn air. The search teams were stumped. How could two people, one an experienced outdoorsman, disappear so completely on a route they knew so well? The media descended, their cameras and questions a constant, painful intrusion on Sarah's private grief. Theories flew around. A tragic accident, an animal attack, a sudden, violent storm that had caught them off guard, even though the weather had been clear. More sinister whispers suggested foul play, though there wasn't a shred of evidence. Some even hinted David might have disappeared on purpose, but Sarah wouldn't believe that. He loved Ethan too much. He loved her. Days turned into weeks. The official search was slowly scaled back. Resources were limited, and the sheer size of the Blackwood wilderness was a tough opponent. The yellow jackets of the searchers became less common, the hum of helicopters faded, replaced by the haunting sigh of the wind through the trees. Ethan's 10th birthday came and went, a silent, agonizing milestone. The presents Sarah had bought lay unopened, gathering dust, symbols of a joy that had been cruelly stolen. The hope that had flickered so desperately in Sarah's heart began to dim, threatening to be snuffed out entirely by the crushing weight of the unknown. They were gone, vanished, without a trace. A decade. 10 years feels like an eternity when you're measuring it in moments of grief that just hang in the air. For Sarah Hayes, it was a lifetime lived in the shadow of that one awful day. The world kept spinning, seasons changed, friends offered condolences that eventually trailed off into awkward silences, but Sarah stayed stuck in the past, a prisoner of what experts call ambiguous loss. There were no bodies to mourn, no graves to visit, no clear answers to give even a tiny bit of closure. Just a massive hole where her husband and son used to be. The case of David and Ethan Hayes went cold, filed away in a cabinet, just another unsolved mystery in the history of the Blackwood Mountains. But for Sarah, it was never cold. It was a raw, open wound that just wouldn't heal. She kept Ethan's room exactly as he'd left it, his favorite dinosaur toys still set up for imaginary battles on his desk. She imagined his scent still faintly clung to his pillow. David's hiking boots stood by the door, a silent reminder of their last adventure. She learned to handle the pitying looks, the well-meaning but painful questions. She built up a tough exterior, a shield against a world that couldn't possibly get what her internal turmoil felt like. Sleep wasn't much of an escape, often bringing vivid dreams of David and Ethan, sometimes happy, sometimes terrifying, but always ending with her waking up to the crushing reality that they were gone. The psychological toll was huge. Experts might say ambiguous loss is the most stressful kind because there's no proof of death, leaving families stuck in this constant limbo. Sarah lived that clinical definition every single day. She'd go back to the Blackwood Mountains sometimes, not to hike, but to stand at the trailhead, staring up at the silent peaks that held her secrets. Were they still out there? somewhere? Had they suffered? Were they at peace? The questions were a relentless torment, a maze with no way out. She read about other missing persons cases, about survival stories, about how hard wilderness searches really are. She understood, on an intellectual level, how vast and unforgiving the wilderness could be, how easily it could just swallow people whole. But her heart still clung to tiny, impossible shreds of hope, a desperate refusal to accept that they were really gone for good. Friends urged her to move on, to sell the house, to start a new life. But how could she, when any day, any moment, there might be news? How could she leave the last place they had called home? So she stayed, surrounded by ghosts and memories, a lone figure keeping a lonely watch. The vibrant, energetic woman she once was had faded, replaced by a quiet resilience, a strength forged in the fires of unimaginable pain and unending uncertainty. The silence of their absence was the loudest sound in her life. It was another autumn morning, almost exactly 10 years to the day since David and Ethan had walked out of her life. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning, a painful reminder of that last, perfect day. Sarah was sifting through her mail, the usual boring mix of bills and junk flyers, when she saw it. A single envelope, plain creamy beige, yet it jumped out from the others. It was addressed to her, Sarah Hayes, in handwriting that made her breath catch in her throat. Her heart started hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. The script was familiar, achingly so. It was neater, maybe more deliberate than she remembered, but the slant, the way the S in her name curled just a bit at the end, it was David's. Or a cruel, perfect fake. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the envelope. For a second, she thought she might actually faint. 10 years. 10 years of silence, of imagining every possible scenario, from tragic to just plain bizarre. And now this. A physical thing, something she could touch, something that he might have touched. She sank into a kitchen chair, clutching the envelope like a fragile treasure. Who could have sent this? Was it some kind of twisted hoax? A cruel prank after all this time? Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and a tiny, terrified flicker of hope. The postmark was smudged, hard to read, but it didn't look local. It looked like it had traveled a fair distance. For what felt like an eternity, she just stared at it. The name Sarah Hayes looked back at her. Was it an accusation, a promise, a threat? The urge to rip it open was overwhelming, yet she was paralyzed by a deep dread of what it might say. Confirmation of her worst fears? An explanation that would shatter her world all over again? Or, impossibly, a way back to them? With a shaky breath, Sarah picked up a letter opener from the small pottery jar on the counter, a gift from Ethan from a school craft fair years ago. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was defusing a bomb. The paper sliced through the envelope with a soft, tearing sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside, there was a single folded sheet of paper. It felt thick, substantial. Not just a quick note, but something thought out. She unfolded it, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't shed yet. The same familiar, yet slightly different, handwriting covered the page. It began simply, devastatingly. My dearest Sarah. My dearest Sarah. The words practically leaped off the page, a voice she hadn't heard in a decade, yet as clear as if David were standing right there beside her. Sarah's breath hitched. Her hands shook so violently the paper rattled. She had to put it down on the table, press her palms flat against the cool wood to steady herself before she could read on. If you are reading this, the letter continued, then 10 years have passed. 10 years since I made a decision that I know, with every part of me, has caused you unimaginable pain. There are no words, Sarah, no apology big enough to cover the abyss of grief I threw you into. For that, I am eternally, profoundly sorry. Know that not a day has gone by, not a single hour, where I haven't thought of you, of the life we lost, the happiness I shattered. Sarah's eyes flew across the lines, her mind scrambling to make sense of it all. He was alive. David was alive when he wrote this. And if he was, what about Ethan? She frantically scanned the page for her son's name. Ethan is safe. The next paragraph began, and a choked sob escaped Sarah's lips. Relief, so strong it was physically painful, washed over her, followed immediately by a fresh wave of agony and anger. Safe? Where? How? Why? He is a young man now, David wrote. Strong, resourceful, and kind, despite everything. He remembers you, of course. We talk about you. He misses you. I made sure he never forgot his mother. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, blurring the ink. She wiped them away impatiently, desperate to understand. The letter went on to describe a life she could barely imagine. David confessed to a complete mental and emotional breakdown in the weeks before they disappeared. He talked about mounting financial debts he'd hidden from her, the terror of losing their home, of failing his family. He described a paralyzing despair, a belief that he was a burden, a failure as a husband and father. I wasn't thinking rationally, he admitted. I was drowning, Sarah. I saw the hike, our special place in the Blackwood Mountains, not as an escape for a day, but as an escape for good. A desperate, insane plan started to form in my mind. To take Ethan, to disappear, to start over somewhere remote, off the grid, where my failures couldn't reach us. It was selfish, it was cowardly, it was unforgivable. I convinced myself, in my broken state, that you would be better off without us, free from the debts and the shame I was carrying. He recounted how, on that fateful day, he'd led Ethan off the main trail, deep into a lesser-known, rugged part of the wilderness they'd never explored together before. He had supplies stashed, a small, run-down cabin he'd secretly found and roughly fixed up months earlier, fueled by his growing paranoia. He told Ethan it was a new adventure, a secret camp. Ethan, trusting his father completely, had gone along with it. The first few years were incredibly hard, David wrote. We lived a primitive life, surviving off the land, cut off from everyone. I taught Ethan, schooled him as best I could. It was a harsh life, and many times I almost lost my nerve, almost came back. But shame, and a twisted sense of protecting him from a world I felt had broken me, kept us hidden. I see now the monumental arrogance and cruelty of that decision. Sarah felt a storm of emotions, fury at David's deception, his unilateral decision to rip their family apart, a deep sorrow for the lost years, for Ethan's stolen childhood. A tiny sliver of empathy for the desperation David described, quickly swamped by the sheer awfulness of his actions. He had chosen this. He had condemned her to a decade of torment. The letter didn't give their current location directly. It talked about moving several times, of always looking over their shoulder. But then, towards the end, came a cryptic passage. Ethan has grown restless, David wrote. He deserves more than this hidden life. He wants to see the world, to know his mother again. I am old now, and tired. Perhaps it is time. There's a place, a small, forgotten valley north of the Whisperwind Creek, beyond the old Trapper's Pass in the Blackwood Range. It's marked by 3 ancient pines standing like sentinels. If you ever feel you can, if you ever want to understand, perhaps start there. But be careful, Sarah. The wilderness keeps its secrets well, and some paths, once taken, are hard to return from. The letter ended with another plea for forgiveness. I hope that one day she might find it in her heart to understand, if not excuse. It was signed simply, David. Sarah sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands. David was alive. Ethan was alive. They were out there. The silence of 10 years had been shattered, not by a resolution, but by a new, agonizing set of questions and a fragile, terrifying path forward. The Blackwood Mountains, the scene of her greatest loss, now called to her once more, not with answers, but with a faint, dangerous whisper of hope. The initial shock of the letter gave way to a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief, anger, betrayal, and a desperate, rekindled hope all fought for space inside Sarah. David was alive. Ethan was alive. For 10 years, she'd mourned them, lived with the gaping hole of their absence, and now this. A confession, an explanation of sorts, and a cryptic clue. Her first instinct was to run, to scream, to somehow let out the immense pressure building inside her. Her second was to call the police. David had committed a crime, hadn't he? Parental kidnapping, at the very least. He'd put her through a decade of unimaginable suffering. She picked up the phone, her finger hovering over the emergency number. But then she paused. The letter. It was a plea, a confession, but also a tentative reach out. If she got the authorities involved right away, what would happen? Would David and Ethan, if they really were near this, Whisperwind Creek, just disappear again, deeper into the wilderness, maybe for good this time? The letter hinted Ethan wanted to reconnect. Could a heavy-handed police response destroy that fragile chance? Sarah paced her living room, the letter clutched in her hand. The Blackwood Mountains loomed large in her window, a silent, brooding presence. David's words echoed in her mind. Be careful, Sarah. The wilderness keeps its secrets well. After hours of agonizing back and forth, she made a decision. She wouldn't go to the police. Not yet. This felt too personal, too raw. David's letter was to her. It was her pain, her search. And it was Ethan, her son, who was caught in the middle. She needed to understand more, to see for herself, before bringing in the authorities. The risk of them disappearing again felt too big. But she couldn't do this alone. The Blackwood Mountains were vast and dangerous, especially the remote areas David described. She thought of old Sheriff Brody, who'd led the initial searches 10 years ago. He was retired now, but he knew those mountains better than anyone. He'd always treated her with kindness and respect, never brushing off her pain. With trembling hands, Sarah found Brody's number. He listened patiently as she told him about the letter, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't interrupt, didn't question if she was losing it. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah, he finally said, his voice gravelly but kind. This is a lot to take in. David alive? And Ethan? After all this time. He sighed. Whisperwind Creek, north of the old Trapper's Pass, marked by 3 ancient pines. I know the general area. It's remote. Very remote. Not a place people go. He agreed to help her, unofficially. He understood why she didn't want to involve the current department right away, the fear of scaring them off. He warned her of the dangers, the slim chances, but he also heard the desperate hope in her voice. We'll take it slow, Sarah, he said. We'll go take a look. But you need to be prepared for anything. Or nothing. A small team was quietly put together. Brody, Sarah, and a younger, trusted former colleague of Brody's, an experienced tracker named Marcus. They studied maps, old and new. Whisperwind Creek was barely a footnote on most, just a thin blue line winding through an uninviting stretch of dense forest and rugged foothills. The old Trapper's Pass was more of a local legend, a route supposedly used by fur trappers back in the 19th century, long since swallowed by nature. Sarah felt a surge of nervous energy, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a decade. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak on her shoulders, but now it was mixed with a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of anticipation. She packed a small bag, her old hiking boots pulled from the back of the closet. She was going back into the mountains, not as a mourner this time, but as a seeker. She was going to find her son, and she was going to confront her husband. The letter had opened a door, and with a heart full of fear and a sliver of hope, Sarah Hayes was about to step through it. The journey to find Whisperwind Creek was grueling, a stark reminder of just how unforgiving the Blackwood Mountains could be. Brody, despite his age, moved with a practiced ease through the dense undergrowth, while Marcus, a generation younger, had an almost uncanny knack for reading the subtle signs of the trail or lack of one. Sarah, fueled by a desperate adrenaline, pushed herself to keep up, her mind a constant storm of what-ifs. They drove as far as a rugged logging road would take them, then set out on foot. The first few miles were on barely used game trails, But soon even those vanished, and they were navigating by compass, map, and Brody's memory of the land. The old trapper's pass was more myth than reality, a treacherous scramble over loose rocks and through tangled rhododendron bushes. Days blurred into a tough routine of hiking, setting up camp, and pushing on. Sarah found herself looking at the wilderness with new eyes. 10 years ago, it had been the evil force that had stolen her family. Now, it was a potential hiding place, a landscape that held clues, however faint. Every unusually bent branch, every oddly placed stone, sparked a momentary flicker of hope or anxiety. Was this a sign? Had David and Ethan passed this way? Marcus, with his sharp tracker's senses, occasionally pointed out things Sarah would have missed. Faint dips in the earth that might have been old footprints, branches snapped in a way that didn't look natural. But these were vague, like ghosts of passage that could have been left by anyone, or anything, years ago. As they got closer to the area Brody thought was the likely spot for Whisperwind Creek, the terrain got even tougher. Deep ravines, dense forest canopy that blocked out the sun, and an unnerving silence filled the air. It was a place that felt utterly isolated, a world away from civilization. Sarah couldn't imagine living here, not for a few weeks, let alone years. How had David managed? How had Ethan endured it? The emotional toll on Sarah was immense. Each step was a battle between hope and despair. What if the letter was a cruel trick? What if David had exaggerated, or worse, lied about Ethan being alive and well? What if they found nothing but an empty, abandoned camp, or something far more tragic? Brody and Marcus were stoic, supportive, but Sarah knew they had their own doubts. Then, on the fourth day of their trek, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. He knelt, pointing to the ground. There, pressed into a patch of damp earth near a small stream, was a footprint. It was relatively fresh, maybe a day or two old. It was made by a worn boot, smaller than a man's, but larger than a child's. Could it be Ethan's? Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Sarah. A little further on, they found it. Whisperwind Creek, a narrow, fast-flowing stream cutting through a small, sheltered valley. And there, on a slight rise overlooking the creek, stood 3 towering, ancient pine trees, their branches gnarled and weathered, exactly as David's letter had described. Sentinels of a hidden world. A barely noticeable path, almost invisible to an untrained eye, led from the creek bank up towards the pines. As they followed it, the undergrowth thinned out a bit, suggesting someone passed through regularly, even if not often. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. They were close. Close to something. The path opened into a small, hidden clearing. Tucked amongst the trees, almost camouflaged by the wilderness around it, was a crudely built cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled lazily into the still air. Someone was here, or had been, very recently. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. Brody put a calming hand on her arm. Marcus moved forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the area. The clearing was tidy, a small vegetable patch struggling in the dappled sunlight, a pile of neatly chopped firewood stacked against one wall of the cabin. There were signs of life, of a life carved out of the wilderness. "David," Sarah called out, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to carry in the profound silence of the valley. "Ethan?" No immediate answer. The only sound was the gentle murmur of Whisperwind Creek and the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. Sarah's heart sank. Had they missed them? Had they run off when they heard them coming? Then, the cabin door creaked open. A figure emerged, stepping slowly into the pale sunlight. It was a young man, tall and lean, with shaggy brown hair that fell across his forehead. He wore simple, patched clothes and well-worn boots. He moved with a quiet grace, his eyes, the same deep blue as David's, wary and uncertain. He looked to be around 20 years old. Sarah stared, her mind struggling to match this young man with the 10-year-old boy burned into her memory. But there was no mistaking him. The set of his jaw, the way he held his head. It was Ethan, her son, alive, standing right in front of her. "Ethan," she choked out, tears instantly welling in her eyes. The young man's gaze fixed on her, a flicker of recognition, of confusion, of a deep, buried pain crossing his face. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, deeper than she remembered, but unmistakably him. Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. A sob tore from her chest, and she stumbled forward, her arms outstretched. Ethan met her halfway, and they collided in a desperate, clinging hug. Years of pain, of longing, of unspoken words poured out in that single, profound moment of reunion. Sarah held her son, this grown man who was still her little boy, and wept. What for the lost years, for the pain they had all endured, and for the miracle of this impossible moment. After what felt like an eternity, they drew apart, though Sarah kept her hands on his arms, as if afraid he might vanish again. "Your father?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where is David?" Ethan's expression clouded. He looked towards the cabin. He's not well, Mom," he said quietly. "He's been sick for a while now. The letter, he wrote it a long time ago, when he first started to get really weak. He made me promise to send it if anything happened to him, or when I felt I couldn't stay here alone anymore." A cold dread gripped Sarah. She looked past Ethan, towards the cabin door. Brody and Marcus hung back, giving them space, their faces etched with a somber understanding. Ethan led her inside. The cabin was sparse but clean. A simple cot lay in one corner. On it, covered by a rough blanket, lay David Hayes. He was gaunt, his skin pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. His eyes were closed. He looked decades older than his true age, the harshness of their hidden life, and perhaps his guilt, etched deeply into his face. Sarah approached the cot, her heart aching. This wasn't the triumphant confrontation she had sometimes imagined, filled with anger and accusations. This was just sad, terribly sad. She knelt beside him, taking his frail, cool hand in hers. His skin felt like paper. His eyes fluttered open, slowly focusing on her face. A flicker of surprise, then a deep, weary recognition. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice raspy, weak. "You came." "David," she said softly, tears streaming down her face again. "Oh, David, what have you done?" A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "Forgive me," he breathed. "Ethan, take care of Ethan." His eyes drifted towards his son, who stood silently in the doorway, his face a mask of grief. Then, with a soft sigh, David's eyes closed again. This time, they did not reopen. The raw grief of David's passing, mixed with the shock and miracle of finding Ethan, left Sarah in a daze. In that remote, silent valley, surrounded by the wilderness that had been both their prison and their sanctuary, a chapter of her life, and theirs, had come to a stark, poignant end. Brody and Marcus handled the practical things with quiet efficiency. They used their satellite phone to contact the nearest authorities, explaining what had happened. It would take time for a team to reach their remote spot. In the meantime, they helped Ethan make preparations. As they waited, Ethan began to talk. Hesitantly at first, then with a growing urgency, as if a dam had broken. He spoke of their life in the wilderness, the early years of fear and confusion, his father's increasingly erratic behavior, and then the long, slow slide into a quiet routine of survival. He talked about his father's teachings, how to hunt, to fish, to identify edible plants, to read the stars. David had poured all his knowledge of the wilderness into Ethan, maybe as a way of making up for things, or maybe just to make sure his son could survive if left alone. Ethan spoke of his loneliness, of his longing for the mother he barely remembered, for a world he had only heard about in David's increasingly jumbled stories. He confessed that his father had been declining for over a year, his strength failing, his mind often lost in the past. The letter, Ethan explained, had been David's final act, a desperate attempt to give his son a future, even if it meant exposing his own past. Ethan had kept it, hidden, unsure of what to do, until his father's condition became undeniable and his own isolation unbearable. He'd finally ventured out to the nearest remote settlement with a post office weeks ago, sending the letter that had turned Sarah's world upside down. He had returned to the cabin to care for his father, hoping against hope his mother would come. The story that unfolded was one of desperation, mental illness, and a profound, misguided love. David hadn't been a monster, Sarah realized, but a man broken by pressures he couldn't face, who had made a catastrophic series of choices. The anger she had carried for a decade began to soften, replaced by a deep, aching sadness for him, for Ethan, for the life they had all lost. When the authorities finally arrived, the scene was handled with as much sensitivity as possible, largely thanks to Brody's quiet intervention. There would be questions, of course, investigations, formalities. David's actions had legal consequences, even in death. But for Sarah, the legal stuff faded into the background. Her focus was solely on Ethan. Leaving the Blackwood Mountains this time was different. Sarah walked beside her son, this young man who was a stranger in so many ways, yet so deeply a part of her. The wilderness still felt vast and mysterious, but it no longer felt entirely evil. It had given her son back, even if it came at a terrible cost. The resolution wasn't complete. It was messy. There was no neat bow to tie around this story. David was gone, and with him, many unanswered questions. Ethan faced the huge task of readjusting to a world he had never truly known, a world that had moved on without him for 10 years. Sarah, too, had to find a new path, no longer the grieving widow and mother of a lost child, but the mother of a survivor, a young man scarred by an extraordinary past. The days and weeks after their return from Whisperwind Creek were a blur of adjustments, emotions, and hesitant discoveries. Ethan, quiet and observant, took in the modern world with a mix of awe and apprehension. Simple things Sarah took for granted, electricity, running water, supermarkets, television, were marvels to him. He was like a time traveler, shot from a primitive existence straight into the 21st century. There were therapy sessions for both of them. Ethan needed help processing his isolated upbringing, the loss of his father, and the sudden plunge into a complex society. Sarah needed help navigating her own tangled emotions, the joy of Ethan's return, the lingering grief for David, the anger that still bubbled up at unexpected moments, and the profound sadness for the stolen years. The story of David and Ethan Hayes became a local legend, whispered in hushed tones. Some saw David as a villain, a kidnapper who had robbed his son of a normal life and his wife of her family. Others, with more compassion, saw a tragic figure, a man who'd succumbed to mental illness and desperation. Sarah found herself somewhere in between, struggling to reconcile the loving husband she remembered with the man who had made such devastating choices. Ethan, remarkably, showed little bitterness towards his father. He spoke of David's kindness, his patience in teaching him, the stories he told by the fireside. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the demons David had wrestled with. His grief for his father was real and profound. For Sarah, the weight of knowing the truth was immense, yet in some ways, it was lighter than the burden of not knowing. The ambiguous loss that had haunted her for a decade was replaced by a tangible reality, however painful. She had her son back. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, not the family she had lost, but it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild. The mysterious letter, once a symbol of hope and terror, now lay tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the extraordinary journey that had brought her son home. It had been a whisper from the past that had irrevocably changed her future. The questions didn't all disappear. Would Ethan ever fully adjust? Could she ever truly forgive David? What would their lives look like now? But these were questions they could face together. The silence had been broken, and in its place, however fragile, there was now conversation, connection, and the slow, painstaking process of healing. The Blackwood Mountains still stood on the horizon, but their shadow no longer felt quite so dark, quite so absolute. They were a reminder of loss, yes, but also of survival, and the enduring, unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The story of Sarah, David, and Ethan Hayes, while fictional, really touches on themes that are all too real for many families. What do you think about David's motivations? Could you ever forgive an act like that? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you find these kinds of deep dives into complex human stories compelling, think about subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations. The tale of the Hayes family is a journey into the heart of a lasting mystery, one that ultimately peeled back layers of human weakness, desperation, and the amazing resilience of the human spirit. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest wilderness isn't the one in mountains and forests, but the one that can exist inside the human mind. The arrival of a letter, just a fragile piece of paper after a decade of silence, sparked an ending no one could have seen coming. Not a perfect resolution, but a poignant, complex reclaiming of lives shattered by a single, devastating choice. While this particular story is made up, the echoes of such disappearances and the deep impact of ambiguous loss are felt in countless real-world cases. The pain of not knowing, that tiny sliver of hope that refuses to die, the courage it takes to face an uncertain future, these are things we all experience. The story reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, a flicker of connection, a whisper from the past, can sometimes light a path forward, even if it leads to answers as heartbreaking as they are healing. Thanks for joining us on this journey.